Hi, I'm here today to summarize a paper for you. This paper is called Perceptions of Scientific Research Literature and Strategies for Reading Papers Depend on Academic Career Stage. This is written by two professors of plant science in the UK, Dr. Catherine Hubbard and Dr. Sonia Dunbar, who work at different universities. I believe they used to work together at the University of Cambridge, and Catherine Hubbard has moved on to the University of Hull since then, so probably one was the other student. But on the side of their plant research, they looked into how students and researchers read scientific literature. So reading science is a frequent task for scientists. That's probably somewhat obvious. About 23% of work time is spent reading, according to many surveys of scientists, and some report reading as many as 280 papers a year, a ton of papers. Reading a scientific paper is also a really specific skill that is really challenging at first, but is built over time. You gain those skills that are sort of within the set that are required to read papers. There's a lot of specialized vocabulary. The language in this kind of writing is both very concise most of the time, but also very precise. And students are expected to do it immediately when they arrive at college, because high school is usually literature and textbooks, and textbooks are usually scientific literature condensed down and made a little bit more readable. So basically now, you as a student are expected to know how to do this. But unfortunately, that familiarity is not something that students just immediately possess. It's something that increases through their academic career. A little sidebar here, you may have noticed that it's actually part of the learning outcomes for this class. Part of my intention is that you do get better at this task. So there is some previous research showing that good tools and resources exist to help students learn how to read scientific papers. If you Google how to read a psychology paper, there are millions of results, almost 500 million, in fact. And typically, use of those resources leads to reporting of better understanding and more interest in reading scientific papers. And that could potentially be a key for universities to think about, because STEM majors tend to have a little bit of trouble keeping students all the way through their major, especially students from underrepresented backgrounds who are sorely needed in the professoriate. There are not very many professors of color in a wide variety of fields, but especially in the STEM fields. Journal clubs also help increase skill and enjoyment, meaning that if you practice reading papers, you get better at it and you start to like it better. Sometimes faculty write documents about how to read papers, and those have really specific strategies that are sometimes hard to interpret or just too idiosyncratic for students to understand, because when an expert explains something to a novice, they have to be really mindful of how they're explaining, because communicating about your expertise is a difficult skill of its own. But that there is expertise, that faculty, that professors are really good at reading scientific papers, suggests there must be some transition point between being a novice and being an expert. So where does that happen? Let's find out. Who's good at reading papers? When do people get good at reading papers? And what is being good at reading papers? So the researchers gave a survey after spring finals to second and third year STEM undergraduates and a collection of grad students and professors. They don't really talk about an ethics committee in the paper, which I found odd. They have all their survey respondents take a Likert type scale that goes from strongly disagree to strongly agree. They computed some fairly typical post hoc tests to determine whether there are differences in these ordinal data. And then they had an open-ended section where they converted those responses into topics and then word clouds, and I'll show you what a couple of those are. The participants are from a wide variety of biology and psychology majors, mostly different bio majors in the undergrads. You see here and here. and as well in the researchers, the PhD students, postdoctoral researchers, which are people who have their PhD but aren't professors yet, and then academic being professors. So these are all people who are already fairly expert at this, supposedly. There are 300 people in the survey, 260 completed the whole thing, and that's the breakdown of which group, how many were in each group. And I'm going to show you the data. So we're going to see Likert score statements in color. Red is strongly disagree, blue is strongly agree, and it kind of changes by gradient from one end to the other. And we'll show you at the same time the percentage of respondents who said agree or disagree by how it lines up on this axis up top. So it'll look something like this for each one. The question is, I enjoy reading papers. You can see that that there are a good chunk of second-year students who rate that they disagree, and almost no academics who rate that they disagree. So you can see that one kind of shifting upward over time. I know how to find papers on a given topic is something that students solve really quickly, it seems like. By the time they're in their third year, they're quite good at it. Almost nobody disagrees. And then I know how to identify papers that are of critical importance to the area I'm investigating, which means not only can you find them, but you can tell which ones are good and necessary. That also, I think in the next slide, I'll show you the whole rest of this, is something that folks solve around their PhD. I'm confident reading papers without guidance is something that folks get into grad school. I know how to read papers to extract information efficiently. Seems to be something that happens during or potentially slightly after grad school. Although, by the way, notice that most of the respondents here are rating agree for almost all of these questions, except for second-year students saying that they know how to identify papers of critical importance to the area they're investigating. Here we see reading research papers is a good use of my time. Most folks agree with that, which is good. Reading papers is frustrating. We see that decreasing slightly over time. So we're seeing a change in enjoyment. Reading papers is important for my training. Everybody agrees with that. That makes good sense. Reading research papers helps me understand the lecture material. More students agree the older they are. Reading papers is important for success in my exams. More true for the third-year students. So 7% of second-year students reported not reading scientific papers at all, but all the other groups read papers. And it seems like overall their attitude about it becomes more positive over time, if not always within or between one stage and another. Enjoyment definitely increases over time, but not between, again, any individual stages. So it's not like as you move from PhD to postdoc or undergrad to grad school, you're suddenly going to start enjoying. Might not necessarily be the case, just sort of slow burns. The big change in undergrad is an endorsement of the idea that reading research papers is important. It seems like as folks move from second to third year, they start to go, oh, getting primary sources is maybe more important than reading a secondary source like a textbook, because I'm more interested in what's going on right now, or I have much more specific questions than the textbook can answer. But the next important piece is how does reading change? Why do these opinions change over time? And so there are skills that build later, including knowing what's important in your discipline and extracting information efficiently from papers. So to start to get into those topics, here is a graph showing the percentage of participants who considered each section of a paper easy to read. So you can see that most rate the abstract and introduction as easy to read, so in every stage that's easy. But for the discussion, and particularly for results text, results figures and tables, and especially for methods, it seems like there is a dramatic increase in the ease of reading those sections over time. And that's really just, I would say, a result of more experience. As you learn a wider variety of methods and you see more and more different kinds of results and discussion sections, you start to learn to understand them a little more quickly. They start to feel easier to read. They also ask participants to rank the importance of each of those sections, and that's graphed here again by career stage. You can see methods increasing in importance over time. As folks get higher up in their degrees, they start to say, "Ooh, I really need to know exactly how this study was done." So maybe take that as a tip if you're early in these stages by thinking about how exactly you might refocus some of your energy as a reader onto the methods section, even though you might feel like that's the toughest part, because it seems like it's the part that is more and more important to as readers get further along in their academic careers. And of course, results pops up, especially figures and tables toward the end, and you see the abstract in the introduction. The abstract especially plummets, probably because a lot of students read the abstract and then move right on. But as folks get into academia, they need to be reading the whole thing. So the abstract is something they either skim or pass immediately by. So some other results: frequency and reasons for reading. 16% of the second-year undergrads reported reading papers they had found themselves, that is, more than once a week, compared with 41% of PhD students and 63% for professors. So a lot of undergrads are being fed papers by presumably their instructors. Some other ratings change over time. Most interestingly here, as folks go further in their careers, they start to read papers to critically evaluate the data. You could probably say that before then, or you might assume that before then, the younger students are using primary research papers to broaden their knowledge, but they're not exactly rating it that way. And it's a little blunted by the fact that everyone at every stage considers papers to be broadening their knowledge. So we're kind of left with a little bit of a question with these three of maybe what exactly is going on in the second and third year students, the second year students in particular. Why are they reading papers? So here's a couple more. Try to understand the research methods used. Most second years don't really agree with that. To improve my own writing, there's a little bit more disagreeing in general going on there, but again, that one bumps up over time. Fill in gaps in understanding from lectures might be another reason undergrads would read scientific papers, but there's not a lot of agreement there. And here's the big one, maybe: find examples to include in exam answers. If you're in my cognitive class, that's going to be crucial for you as well, as it was for these folks. The professors were also asked to give advice to people learning to read papers. So they gave them an open-ended response section at the end and coded it using a computer program that evaluates data like that. It's called NVivo. And a couple interesting themes came out. So the biggest one was to read selectively within the paper. So read the sections in a specific order, like start with the abstract or start with the figures. But different folks had different suggestions, unfortunately. But definitely prioritize specific sections of the paper and identify the key ideas in the paper or other sort of sub-themes within that reading selectively major theme. It's going to change by discipline what sections are most important, and it might change by the reason you're reading the paper. So maybe a reason to, or a place to start is think about why you're reading this paper in the first place, and use that to direct yourself toward the section that will be most helpful in solving that why for you. Another major theme was practical strategies for reading the paper, and you'll notice here that to the chagrin of most students, a lot of folks recommend reading the paper multiple times. This is common from the early to the late stages of academia. We often read papers multiple times before we gather everything we need from them, and that'll undoubtedly be the case for you too, especially as you're learning the technique and you're new at it. Take your time, don't try to rush through. Use specific sections of the paper to determine whether it's worth reading at all. So if you're only interested in the paper if it does one specific methodological thing, you're going to want to check for that before you read the whole rest of it. Try not to get bogged down in technical details and terminology. That's an especially good tip for undergrads. Papers are written in a very jargony way sometimes, and if the more you can avoid that kind of terminology or just kind of skip past it, gather what it means through context, the better off you're going to be, because you're going to get through the thing as opposed to getting stuck trying to look up what 10 different words mean. On the other hand, if it's a regular look up easy word, look it up in the dictionary real quick and see what it means, so that you know precisely what they're trying to say. But if you're working in a place where there's just too much technical language or lots of really specific terminology within like a specific psych domain, it might be wise to try to move around some of that, or to not worry yourself about understanding fully exactly what some of it means. Another major theme is to read critically, assess whether the author's conclusions match the data. Students are surprised to find out that this doesn't always happen, and it definitely doesn't. There are papers written in which there are major logical leaps or mistakes or just full-on errors, so it's important to watch for those and interpret the data for yourself beyond what the authors present it as well. And then, of course, what we started with, read the paper with a specific purpose or questions in mind. It can be really helpful to start with questions and look for the answers to those questions. These are all solid tips. Here's a word cloud extracted from the advice. So these are things to focus on. The larger the word is, the more frequently it was mentioned. So looking at figures and results and reading through the abstract, ensuring that you understand, and the discussion and the method section seem to be the things that pop out. I'll mention one more time that the most common general suggestion was to read the paper multiple times. 18 out of about 80 respondents brought that up. Okay, so from students to professors, everybody agrees that reading scientific papers is important. Undergrads almost all read them, but report low confidence in their ability to do so. Professors, though, are confident in their reading. They read differently, though, and they emphasize methods and results in a way that students don't. Keep in mind that these data are from one university and are mostly biology-type departments, and it's a university that is small and research-intensive, from which a large percentage of students go on to science careers. So these might be a particular type of folks. But it's interesting for us to continue thinking about why might undergrads think abstracts are most important while professors do not. I already proposed one answer to you, that I think maybe sometimes students read the abstract and then move on and consider the paper read. But why might professors skip over intro and conclusion sections? Something interesting to think about. I would argue that they already know the literature, so they can kind of predict some of that argumentation. Oh, and in addition to my bad-mouthing of students, I don't mean to say that folks skip over, just read the abstract and move on. It might be all you feel like you can do, right? It's all the skill set enables. So that's possible too. Third question I have, might there be a link between what's important and how difficult the task is? So could the changing of those two things happen at the same time? The fact that at some point in grad school it becomes easier and the focus becomes different. That's maybe. The answer to that is maybe. But there is some interesting modeling of how people learn over time, and they typically look at how familiar they are with the topic and what kind of motivation they have to learn about the topic. And so you could kind of map out our groups this way, where as folks become more familiar, they are also changing in their motivation to read scientific papers. Undergrads read papers because it's part of an assignment. Academics read papers because they want to. And so that move from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation from the left to the right of this slide is crucial to keep in mind alongside that change in familiarity. So instructors should be mindful of the possible lack of background knowledge students have when trying to read scientific papers, strive to offer that knowledge before requiring reading. I wrote, hey, weird. I do my best to do that for you all. You could think about using the create approach as a student. Consider the question, then read it, try to elucidate the hypothesis for yourself, analyze and interpret the data, and then think of the next experiment. This is a good way to sort of come up with takeaways from a paper. And really, this is good for you potentially no matter what level of student you are, even if you're a professor, even if you've done this for a very long time. So this create approach is something nice that is backed by data. It's also true that, and important to think about, anyone reading in a second language or reading while having dyslexia might also find supports like these helpful. And hopefully, if you're a student watching this, knowing that even career academics find some papers challenging should be helpful for your morale. One quote I pulled out of the discussion section of the paper is that though they did not explore specific causes of the frustration students feel in greater detail, previous studies and their interactions with students suggest that background knowledge, terminology, generic attributes of papers, and unfamiliar techniques are the most challenging aspects of papers for inexperienced readers. So I think the next study could look into those specific ideas, those specific points of frustration. Again, this is, or maybe not again, but I want to finish by saying this is a very important question because there is science and data everywhere these days, particularly these days. So we will need to think carefully about how people read it in the coming years, especially as we continue to do more armchair science from our homes and more people encourage each other to do their own research. I think when folks say do your own research, they don't mean go and conduct the study. They mean go and look at the research yourself. And so developing the skills to do that is a challenge and something we need to continue to think about. Thanks for watching the video. I'll take questions and see you in the next one. Okay, mask off. That was me modeling a presentation. I went a little bit long, but I want you to think about what I did if you're using this to think about your own presentation forward. Was I interactive? No, this is recorded. I showed you the figures. I made the sentences from the paper readable by sort of rewording them. I quoted the paper sparingly. I went outside the paper a little bit. Oop, I included a typo. I did some Googling. I looked up some other papers. I pulled in that model of motivation and familiarity. That might not be as easy for you because you're not as familiar with some of these things, but if you do some extra Googling, that can always fill in some of your knowledge around the edges. I went long, and look, it's on the slide, so I knew I was going to go long, but I didn't go that long. I'm surprised. Here's the citation of the paper one last time. What else did I do? I dressed comfortably, dress however you like, but in a way that makes you feel confident and ready to talk. I made sure my lighting was good, my recording was working before I went ahead and did the whole thing, yeah, I think that's everything. So once again, thanks for watching, and I hope this video is helpful.